A billionaire agrees to marry a homeless woman on a bet. But what he discovers on their very first night together will change everything he thought he knew about himself. Before we get into it, drop a comment and let us know where in Canada you're watching from. Now let's tell you about Gavin Merritt. Gavin Merritt had never lost a bet in his life, and he saw no reason to start on a Thursday evening at the Royal Ontario Museum. He was standing near the grand staircase of the Beaumont Foundation Charity Gala, a glass of wine in one hand, and his jaw set in that particular way that made junior associates nervous and rivals anxious. At 38, he was the kind of man who occupied space with intention, tall, angular, dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent in the city. He'd written a check for $400,000 to the Children's Hospital Foundation that evening and felt absolutely nothing doing it. That was the problem with generosity when it came without effort. It stopped meaning anything at all. "You're doing that thing again," said Stefan, sliding up beside him with a scotch and a grin that was 20% charm and 80% trouble. Stefan was his oldest friend from their days at Rotman, now running a venture capital firm out of the financial district. He was also the only person in Toronto who said whatever he wanted to Gavin and didn't get fired for it. What thing? Standing there like you're calculating the structural load of the entire room. Gavin took a sip of his wine, force of habit. Stefan glanced across the atrium, then shifted his gaze deliberately toward the museum's glass front doors, through which the October night was visible, cold, orange-lit, the street beyond still wet from earlier rain. Gavin looked. On the wide stone steps outside, a woman sat with a duffel bag between her feet and her arms wrapped around herself. She wore faded green scrubs under a thin canvas jacket. Her dark hair was pulled back in a loose knot. She wasn't begging. There was no cup, no cardboard sign. She was just sitting, watching nothing in particular, with the stillness of someone who had run out of somewhere else to be. "You know what your problem is?" Stefan said quietly. "You think money can buy anything, turn anything around." "It usually can." "Prove it." Stefan turned to face him fully, and Gavin recognized the expression, that particular blend of mischief and calculation that had pulled them both into trouble more than once. $2.5 million says you can't make that work. 90 days. You marry her, you present her to society, you stay married the full 90 days. If you pull it off, I wire you the money. If she leaves or you fold, you wire it to me, plus $1 million to whatever charity she names. It was an offensive proposition. Objectively, a terrible idea. Gavin knew both of those things. He also knew that he hadn't felt genuinely interested in a challenge in over 2 years, and that the absence had been hollowing things out inside him in ways he hadn't yet found words for. He looked at the woman on the steps again. Even from here, there was something in the way she held herself. Not broken, not pleading, simply present in her own difficult stillness. "Fine," he said, and set his glass on the nearest tray. Her name was Lena Prudhomme, and she did not want anything from Gavin Merritt. She told him this within the first 2 minutes, which he hadn't expected. He had walked out of the museum into the cold, sat down on the step beside her without being invited, and introduced himself, not with his title, just his name. She'd looked at him the way someone looks at a door-to-door salesman, politely, completely unmoved. "I'm not interested in propositions from men in expensive suits," she said. Her voice was steady, with the trace of a Franco-Ontarian accent at the edges, someone who'd grown up somewhere north of the city. He told her plainly what he was offering. A contract arrangement, 90 days, everything documented and reviewed by legal counsel before she signed anything. Her own room, her own schedule, meals, clothing, and at the end of it, $800,000 deposited wherever she chose. Lena was quiet. "Why me?" "Because you're here," he said. It was a cold answer, and she heard the coldness in it. Something shifted behind her eyes, not quite hurt, more like recognition, like she'd known the answer before she asked and had asked anyway to confirm what kind of person she was dealing with. She nearly stood up and walked away. He could see it in the way her shoulders moved. But she didn't. "My younger sister needs spinal surgery," she said finally. "Private clinic in Montreal. OHIP won't cover the full cost. It's $230,000 we don't have." She looked at him. "So if I do this, every term is in writing. My own legal representation before I sign anything." You have a lawyer? I had a career, she said quietly. I know how to find one. He nodded. Deal. The civil ceremony at Old City Hall took 9 minutes. There were no guests, only Gavin's lawyer, Bertrand, who looked as if he'd rather be anywhere else on earth, and a courthouse clerk who seemed entirely indifferent to the particularity of the arrangement. Lena wore a gray wool blazer borrowed from a woman at the shelter where she'd been staying for the past 6 weeks. She signed her name with the same steady hand she'd once used for patient charts. That evening, Gavin's driver took them north into Rosedale, and the iron gate of his property opened onto a long gravel drive lined with maples gone a violent orange in the season. The house was everything she'd expected. 12-foot ceilings, carved oak staircase, a painting above the landing that probably cost more than a year's nursing salary. Your room is at the end of the south hallway, Gavin said. The north wing is mine. Knock before entering any shared space. If you need something, Bertrand handles logistics. And between the two of us, she said, what are the rules? He considered. Breakfast at 7:30 if you want it. You're not required. Beyond that, honesty. If something doesn't work, say so. All right, she picked up her bag, and for what it's worth, I won't make this harder than it needs to be. I appreciate that. I'm not doing it for you, she said simply. I'm doing it because I'd like to get through the next 90 days with my dignity intact. She went upstairs. He stood in the entrance hall for a moment longer, listening to the sound of her footsteps, which did not hurry. It was past midnight when Gavin sat in his study going through the intake documents Bertrand had filed. Identification, contact information, emergency next of kin. Standard procedure. He was about to close the folder when something slipped from the back of the document sleeve. A laminated card creased at one corner. Registered nurse, Lena Prudhomme, RN St. Michael's Hospital, Toronto, Surgical and Palliative Care. Status, suspended pending investigation, October 2022. He stared at the dates. His mother, Lena Merritt, had been admitted to St. Michael's Palliative Care Ward in June of 2022. She had died there in August, on a Wednesday afternoon, while Gavin was in a conference call he had not left in time to say goodbye. He set the card down. Then he stood, walked to the hall closet where he'd kept a box of his mother's belongings for 2 years, the things he'd never been able to open, and he brought it to his desk. Inside, under a stack of crossword books and a photograph of him at 9 years old on a dock in Muskoka, there was an envelope, written on the front in his mother's handwriting, from LP. Keep this one, Gav. He opened it. A notacard written in careful, unhurried script. Marielle, thank you for the Alice Munro stories. Thank you for telling me about Gavin's first hockey game. Thank you for letting me sit with you on the hard mornings. I'll carry those hours with me for a long time. Yours, L. Gavin read it 3 times. He sat down on the floor of his study with the card in his hands and did not move for a very long time. He didn't mention it in the morning. Instead, breakfast happened in near silence. Gavin with his coffee and the Globe and Mail, Lena with toast and the settled posture of someone accustomed to eating alone. When she asked what was expected of her in the coming weeks, he set the paper down. We have a dinner at the Albany Club in 10 days. The Beaumont Foundation's board reception. You'll be introduced as my wife. And you expect me to perform. I expect you to be present. I was an RN for 6 years, she said. I managed trauma situations and end-of-life conversations with families in crisis. I think I can handle a cocktail reception. He looked at her for a beat. Then you already know the most important rule. Which is, don't let them see you struggling. Something moved across her face, a recognition she quickly smoothed over. I've known that rule, she said, since long before I met you. A social consultant named Deborah came for 3 sessions in the following days. Lena sat through etiquette instruction with her arms crossed and her expression politely closed. Until, during a discussion of greeting hierarchies, she leaned forward and asked, what are people actually trying to protect with all of this? Because in my clinical experience, most social performance is anxiety management. If I understand what people are anxious about, I can work the room without memorizing a protocol. Deborah blinked. I beg your pardon? Gavin, who had been standing in the doorway for the past minute without announcing himself, turned and walked away before Lena could see him smiling. The Albany Club dinner was, by every measure, a success. Lena moved through the room with a quietness several of his colleagues later independently described as composed and unexpectedly assured. She asked thoughtful questions. She remembered every name. When a board member named Clive made a passing remark about new money being difficult to distinguish from old, Lena turned to him with a pleasant expression and said, "I think that difficulty mostly troubles people who need the distinction in order to feel significant." "Do you find it troubling, Clive?" A moment of silence. Then Clive laughed, genuinely, startled into it, and said she was absolutely right. On the drive home, Gavin looked at her across the back seat. She was watching the city through the window, the wet streets reflecting yellow and white. "Most people don't talk to Clive Beaumont like that," he said. "I know." She didn't look away from the glass. "But I've spent 3 years being talked to like I'm not in the room. I'm not going to do the same to myself, not for anyone." He said nothing, but he thought about those words for a long time afterward. It was Stefan who unraveled everything. He arrived at the Rosedale house on a Saturday afternoon, uninvited, with the easy entitlement of someone who had been doing that since graduate school. Gavin was at the office. Lena was in the back garden, sitting under the old red oak with a library book. She came around the side of the house when she heard voices near the front. She stopped when Stefan's words came clearly through the partly open sitting room window. "Almost A60. You must be feeling good about the payout." A pause, then Stefan again. "The bet. Gavin's social experiment. He's always been obsessed with proving points. This is just the most expensive one," a short laugh. "Though I'll admit he picked well for the optics." Lena stood very still in the side yard. The October wind moved through the maple leaves above her. The cold settled into her chest like something she had been expecting for a while. She had known. She'd known from the beginning, technically. She'd signed the contract. She'd understood the transaction. But hearing herself described as an optic, a chosen piece of someone's proof of concept, was a different thing from knowing it in the abstract. It was the same thing as being called a subject in a clinical file, as having 6 years of careful, dedicated work dismissed with one senior colleague's fabricated report, and no one in the institution willing to look past the paperwork. She went inside through the back door. She went upstairs, packed her duffel with exactly what she'd arrived with, and left the wardrobe of clothes hanging neat and untouched. She took her nursing ID, her sister Ada's medical reports, and the small cedar box her mother had pressed into her hands the day she graduated from nursing school. She walked out into the city and didn't look back. She made it to a 24-hour Tim Hortons near Queen Street West before her legs gave out. She sat in a plastic chair with a medium coffee cooling in her hands and tried to think clearly about what came next. The shelter where she'd been staying was full. She'd already checked. Ada was in Sudbury, 7 hours north. She had no car. She sat there until the coffee went cold. Then she put her head down on her arms at the table, and the exhaustion of the past 2 months, the performing, the holding herself together, the careful management of her own anger, collapsed inward all at once. She was there for almost 3 hours before Gavin found her. He'd come home to discover her gone, the wardrobe untouched, and Stefan sitting in the living room with a guilty expression that made the explanation unnecessary. He had driven himself, not waited for the driver, and had worked outward from the house in a methodical spiral. Checking 6 locations before the Tim Hortons window showed him a woman with dark hair asleep at a corner table. He sat down across from her. He didn't say her name loudly or touch her shoulder. He just sat until she stirred and looked up at him. Her eyes, when they focused, were not the eyes of someone who had been crying. They were very clear and very tired and entirely certain about what they saw. "Go home, Gavin. I'd like to explain." "I know what there is to explain." She straightened in the chair. "I signed the contract. I understood what this was. What I didn't understand was how publicly it was known, that I was a project, that your friends were in on it." He was quiet for a moment. "I canceled the bet 3 weeks ago." She looked at him. "I told Stefan it was done and forfeited what I owed him." He set his hands flat on the table between them. "I should have told you when I did it. I didn't know how to explain something I barely understood in myself at the time." "Why did you cancel it?" He reached into his coat pocket and placed the note card on the table in front of her. Lena looked down at it. She recognized the handwriting immediately, the precise loops, the old-fashioned courtesy of it. Her breath stopped for a moment. "Where did you get this?" she said, barely audible. "She kept it. I found it in a box of her things I hadn't opened since she passed." He paused. "She was your patient." Lena pressed her fingers briefly over her mouth. When she lowered her hand, her expression had no protective layer left in it. "She was my patient for 4 months," she said. "She was one of the most remarkable people I've ever had the privilege of sitting with." "She wrote about you," he said it quietly. "In her last letter to me, she mentioned the nurse who brought her Monroe stories. I didn't know who LP was until I saw your ID in the file. If you've followed this far, go ahead and drop the word cardinal in the comments. You'll know why by the end." A long silence opened between them. Around them, the Tim Hortons carried on its ordinary late-night life. Students, people on night shift, a couple sharing a single muffin at the next table. "She died the week after I was suspended," Lena said. "I wasn't there. I kept thinking, if I had been there, if that hadn't happened the way it did." "That wasn't your fault." "I know," rationally. She looked at her hands, "But guilt doesn't care about rationality." "No," he said, "it doesn't." She came back to the house, not because she had nowhere else to go. She had made that mistake once and would not repeat it. She came back because she chose to, and she told him that, and he accepted it without relief or gratitude, which was the right response. She would stay through the 90 days. After that, they would see. In the weeks that followed, Gavin asked her what she'd actually intended to do with the settlement money, beyond the surgery. She told him about an idea she'd been carrying for 2 years. A support network for healthcare workers who'd been wrongly dismissed or burned out of the system. People who fell through the cracks of professional accountability with no one to advocate for them. "I want to call it the Anchor Project," she said. "Because when everything else is gone, you still need something to hold. Let me fund it. I don't want your money. I know. But I have capital that should be doing something more useful than sitting in index funds. And I think," he paused, "I think my mother would have agreed with every word of what you just said." She looked at him for a long moment. "Fine, but I run it." Obviously. They visited 3 community health clinics together that month, 2 in Toronto, 1 in Hamilton. At each one, Gavin did something that surprised her. He listened, not for the room, not for anyone watching. He sat for 40 minutes with a nurse named Anita in Hamilton, who'd been pushed out of the ER over a documentation error, and he asked her careful questions, and on the drive back along the 403 he was very quiet. "What are you thinking?" Lena asked. "That I've spent 15 years deciding where money goes, and I've never once asked the people it affects whether it was going to the right place." He kept his eyes on the highway. "That's a significant gap." She turned to watch the evening traffic. "It's not too late to close it," she said. In December, he drove her to Sudbury. She hadn't been back since her mother's funeral 2 years earlier, and she watched the Canadian Shield open up around them north of Barrie. The pre-Cambrian rock faces, the black spruce, the first real snow of the season sitting in the hollows between outcroppings. She directed him along a regional road between frozen lakes until they reached a small house at the end of a gravel lane, empty now but kept warm by a neighbor who had a spare key. Inside, it smelled of pine and old books. There were photographs on the mantel. Her mother, her sister Ada, a younger Lena in nursing school scrubs holding her degree certificate with both hands, chin up, eyes bright with the particular confidence of someone who has just earned something that mattered. "My dad got sick when I was 12, she said, moving through the small rooms as though relearning them. "Hodgkin's lymphoma. We drove to the cancer center every week, and there was a nurse named Kathy there who knew his name every single time, who explained things to my mother in plain language so she actually understood what was happening." She picked up a framed photo of her father, thin but smiling at a backyard barbecue. "I decided right then what I wanted to do." Gavin stood in the middle of the small living room. Through the front window, white birches stood against the early darkness. "And then you did," he said. "And then I did, until someone decided I was a convenient scapegoat." She set the photo back on the shelf. "The pharmacist who reported me was running the same scheme at a clinic in Mississauga. He was caught 8 months after I was suspended. The investigation against me was closed quietly. She looked at the mantel rather than at him. Nobody called to tell me. I found out from a lawyer I consulted about something entirely unrelated. By then I'd lost the apartment. I'd been off the registry for nearly a year and She stopped. I didn't fight to get reinstated. I should have. I didn't have it in me. Gavin crossed to the armchair near the window and sat down. I hired an investigator, he said. After I found the note card, before I came to find you. He waited a moment. I have the full record, the closure notice, the pharmacist's second incident, all of it. Bertrand has already begun the application to reinstate your nursing registration. With your permission, it should take about 60 days. She stared at him. I should have asked you before I started the process, he said. If you want me to stop. Don't stop. Her voice caught once, then steadied. Don't stop. She sat on the edge of the couch and pressed her palms against her face for a moment. Not crying, just recalibrating, the way someone does when something they had quietly stopped believing in becomes, without warning, possible again. When she looked up, there was no protective layer in her expression at all. She talked about you a lot, you know, Lena said. Your mother. She said you were the kind of person who didn't know what to do with softness, so you'd built a life that never asked for it. She paused. She also said she was prouder of you than you would probably ever let yourself believe. Something shifted in his face. Something that had been held under pressure for a long time. She used to call me on Sunday evenings, he said. I missed 4 of her last 8 calls. I knew the prognosis. I still missed them. She knew why. Lena's voice was gentle. She didn't hold it against you. I hold it against myself. Outside, the first snow of the evening came down through the birch trees, slow and very quiet. You can carry that, she said. Or you can do something with it. She would have said the same thing, and you know it. He nodded, slowly, and looked at his hands. The room held them in its small warmth, the shield country dark beyond the windows, and something between them that had been accumulating since October began, finally, to dissolve. In the morning before they drove south, Gavin found her standing in the backyard between her mother's 2 birch trees. The snow had stopped. The sky was a flat white that made everything look simple. He walked out and stood beside her. I'm not doing this because of a contract, he said. I want to be clear about that. She turned to look at him. I'd like to try, he said, if you're willing. Lena held his gaze. There was still caution there. She was not a person who would stop being cautious quickly, and he did not want her to. Caution was how she had survived. He had come to respect it as one of her more essential qualities. I'm not easy, she said. I know. I'll call you out when you're wrong. I expect that. And the Anchor Project, that's mine. I'm not a project myself. You never were, he said. I was. A pause. Okay, she said. Let's try. He didn't produce a ring. There was no grand gesture. Just a nod, and the 2 of them standing together between the birch trees while the morning sun came over the tree line and lit the snow blue-white at the edges. The second wedding, the real one, was held in March, in the community hall attached to a francophone parish in Lena's neighborhood in Sudbury, on a day when the season was finally beginning to loosen its hold. Ada was there, moving carefully on her post-surgery legs, crying quietly before the ceremony even started. Stefan attended and was, for once in his life, entirely without irony. Bertrand came and managed, for the first time in months, to look like he was somewhere he wanted to be. Lena wore her grandmother's white wool coat over a simple ivory dress. No stylist, no protocol, just herself. During the vows, Gavin held her hands and spoke without notes. I spent 15 years constructing a life that made no emotional demands, he said. I thought that was strength. It was fear. He paused. You've shown me the difference. I don't intend to spend the rest of my life being afraid of the things that actually matter. When it was Lena's turn, she looked at him steadily and said, Your mother was right about you. I'm going to spend a long time proving that to you. The room laughed, warm, genuine, the way people laugh when something true has been said aloud. Lena received her nursing registration back in April, 61 days after the application was filed. She didn't return to St. Michael's. Instead, she took on the role of clinical director at the Anchor Project, which held its first intake session in May. 17 nurses, 2 physicians, and a paramedic, all of whom had been displaced from the healthcare system, for reasons that had nothing to do with their competence. The Millionaire Merit Foundation, which Gavin established in his mother's name, funded the Anchor Project and 3 similar initiatives across Ontario over the following year. He chaired the board and deferred to Lena on every programmatic decision, a habit that amused their colleagues, and that he considered among the better ones he'd ever developed. In late September, the same week the old red oak in the Rosedale garden went fully crimson, Lena told him she was pregnant. He was at the kitchen island with a board report in one hand and coffee in the other. He set both down, crossed the room, and held her with none of the careful economy he had once kept in his body, without the management of distance, without the protective layer. Just fully, for a long moment, without calculation. She would have been over the moon, he said quietly. I know, Lena said. I've been thinking about that all morning. They named their daughter Noelle. Noelle for the clarity that had come to both of them, slowly and at significant cost. Marries for the woman who had known them both before they knew each other, and who had left behind the notes they'd needed to find their way back. In the hospital room, after the nurses had settled Noelle into Lena's arms, Gavin sat in the chair beside the bed and watched his daughter's face. The absolute seriousness of a new person arriving into the world, and thought about Sunday evening calls, and about the ones he hadn't missed, and about the way grief moves through time and becomes something else if you let it. He thought about a woman who had once sat on stone steps in October cold, not begging, just waiting, and who had turned out to be the bravest person he had ever met. Outside the hospital window, the city moved through its ordinary morning. Somewhere across town, the Anchor Project's second cohort was gathering. Ada was on her way down from Sudbury, and in the room itself there was nothing required of anyone except to be present. For the first time in longer than he could honestly account for, Gavin Merritt was exactly that.